Welcome back to Rich Dad Stockcast. I'm your host, Del Denny, and today's episode is all about unlocking the financial philosophies that have changed millions of lives around the world. We're talking about the Rich Dad rules of money, the core principles that Robert Kiyosaki has taught for decades. These are not your typical Wall Street talking points. These are mindset shifts and money strategies that challenge the status quo. And to help break them down, I'm joined by, once again, Rich Dad expert Andy Tanner, one of the best at translating these ideas into practical steps for real investors. And before we dive in, make sure you grab your free tools and resources at stockcastbonus.com. Whether you're just getting started or looking to go deeper, these tools will help you think like the rich and invest like the rich. Andy, always good to have you back.
Hey, great to be with you, Del. Great topic today. There's things that are in the book Rich Dad Poor Dad, but there's also a few more that I picked up from Kim Kiyosaki and Robert along the way in my travels that I think are really, really beneficial that we'll get to, I'm sure, in this episode. So this will be a great one to from front to back.
I sure hope so. I love your travel stories. I think we all do on the podcast. But before we dive into those stories, let's first talk about stockcastbonus.com. Great resources in there. Can you tell us what our listeners receive when they go there?
Yeah, and also share the purpose. Stockcastbonus.com is a great starting place. Maybe someone has had an interest in developing a monthly cash flow in their life for a long, long time, something other than a job. And they have bits and pieces of how other people have done it. And you've seen other people do it, but you'd like to do it yourself and you'd love a good step-by-step resource. There's all kinds of stuff. One of the things that's there, we have, webinars that are educational. We have classes. One of the free resources there is we have ebooks, and those are great places to start because for no cost, you can get a more clear vision and a step-by-step routine. What does it look like? Your routine, this is important. Your routine and your habits are what give you your life. And so a person that just does the same routine will get the same result. So when a person has a chance to improve their routine and say, what are the different things I can begin doing on a weekly basis that begin to bring cash flow to my life? That's what it's for. So yeah, stockcastbonus.com, go there. There's some free stuff and you can get to know us even better. And we can help you much, much more when you introduce yourself, tell us who you are, tell us what you're interested in, and we can begin to help you. So it's a great resource for people who want to get doing stuff or doing stuff better.
There you go. Doing stuff better. Doing stuff's great. Doing stuff better is next
Even
level.
Better.
Even better. I like that designation there. All right. So let's start from the top. What are some of the core money rules from the Rich Dad philosophy that most people either don't know or misunderstand?
Well, it starts in Rich Dad, Poor Dad. And it's funny because people often revere that book and they give that book a lot of praise, well deserved. And I'll say, what do you think of the book Rich Dad, Poor Dad? And they'll say, oh, it's awesome, great. I go, good. What are the 6 lessons? And they can't name one. So it begins with really a very, it's not just a declarative, it's an invitation. He doesn't just state the rule. It almost it stands as an invitation for us to do things better. And the first rule is the rich don't work for money. We'll talk about what they work to do later. They do work. It isn't that they, don't do anything. But what it really says is I'm not going to trade my time for dollars. I'm not going to get in a scenario where, I have a boss and this boss says, do these 5 things and I'll give you a paycheck. That is not a way to get rich because the entrepreneur has the plan to get rich and you're just part of his plan now. You're part of someone else's wealth plan when you do that. And Robert just won't do it. And it's interesting. People don't realize how in their core, both Robert Kiyosaki and also Kim Kiyosaki, it's in their core. I'll give you a little anecdote on how deep that is for them. We were in Singapore and it was a massive event. I mean, it was unbelievable. And we're backstage and you can hear the crowd just rustling with excitement, and there's music playing, and they had a production that was unbelievable. I mean, it's like rock concert type atmosphere, lights and, pyrotechnics and light shows and huge screens. And I mean, it was a massive crowd in Singapore. And I was backstage. We were ready to go out there, and we always taught as a team. And before we were ready to go out, or we were getting ready to go out, I said, Kim, I says, look at all these people, and, look at this movement that you've built for financial education and freedom for people. I mean, God, do you ever just shake your head at what you guys have built in terms of this movement? And she was so humble, and she just has always kept her feet squarely on the ground. And she said this, she goes, Andy, Robert and I used to live in our car. Everything can come and go at any time. And I'm like, here I'm just blown away by this pageantry. And she says, we used to live in our car. We used to sleep on the floor and had to be with friends. We were homeless. I mean, think about that. Now, why were they homeless? Well, they weren't on drugs and they weren't lazy. They just refused to get a job. They'd rather sleep on the floor or in their car. They'd rather not have a house than violate that rule. And that really speaks. Now, I don't know if everyone needs to go to that extreme, but it really speaks to how, they don't just say that, they believed it. They believed it, right? They just refused to get a job. They just would not do it under any circumstances. The rich don't work for money. We want to be rich, so we won't do it. They'd had jobs before. Robert worked for Xerox as one of their top, if not the top, sales rep they had. He could go work for money and make a lot of it, but he was never going to get ultra rich doing that. And so think about that. He could have gone to anywhere and started to sell again, but he just wouldn't do it. There was a principle and a line he wouldn't cross. So that's how deep that is for them.
That is a deep principle, and that actually
interesting story, right? Yeah,
it really is. And one of the other talking points of the Rich Dad philosophy, going along with what you said, is your house is not an asset. Why is that such a controversial idea, and why is it important to really understand that your house is not an asset?
Well, you look at assets from an accounting standpoint, and assets represent what you own to the regular accounting world, right? If you own it, it goes in the asset column. And if you owe it, you borrow it, it goes in the liability column. So there's things that you owe people in life that are liabilities, and things that you own, which are assets. But Robert doesn't think that way. So he took a lot of heat for saying your house is an asset. I remember we were in a meeting one time, and I think he was a medical doctor, so he's a smart guy. I can't pass the MCAT and go to med school. He's a smart guy, but he says, "What do you mean my house is an asset? My house is worth $1 million." And I thought, Robert, he's a Marine. I thought this guy might go hand-to-hand combat, and Robert basically ignored him. And I thought that was a great lesson, because why should Robert try to convince that guy to get rich if he's not there to listen? If he's a better response than arguing when he says your house is an asset. So, yes, it is. I'm smarter than you. That's not teachable. A better response would have been, well, that's an interesting statement. Well, why do you say that? Just like you asked. So the way that Robert looks at assets and liabilities is much more effective than the generally accepted accounting principles that, people around the world accept. He doesn't accept those accounting principles. He says, look, assets put money in my pocket. Liabilities take money out. That is such a much more beautiful rule of money than try to understand your gap total, your generally accepted accounting principles total. He says, look, if I buy something and it feeds me, it's an asset. If I buy something and I have to feed it, well, it's taking money out of my pocket. So our residence that we live in, it may appreciate, but if you sell it, the only way to get cash out of this is to sell it, and then you got no place to live. So you have property taxes, maintenance, all the things that go along, HOA fees if you're in an area like that. all those things that go on with owning that, you can be house poor. And that's a very real thing. Someone is house poor when they have too much house because they can't afford to feed the house and all of their money's in that. They don't have income producing assets. So rule number one, the rich don't work for money. And then the next thing you let into is, look, assets put money in my pocket, liabilities don't. Now, someone might say, well, I know that. I read Rich Dad Poor Dad. I know that. Okay, great. Look at your financial statement. At cash flow bonus, or excuse me, at stockcastbonus.com, part of that ebook is, we teach people a habit of a weekly meeting where you kind of go through that stuff, and you can say it, oh, assets put money in my pocket, liabilities take it out. But once you get out your own financial statement, then evaluate it that way. Well, what do we have that we have to feed, and what do we have that'll feed us? And that's a huge rule of money: is assets produce cash and liabilities suck it out. So it is a different philosophy than what would be in a gap total. It is different. So I understand where the doctor came from, but that thinking wasn't making him rich. It was making him well off.
That's a good point. To continue this vein of thought, Robert said, and Kim has said this as well, the rich make money work for them. So the question that I have is, how do they use assets like stocks or real estate to generate income instead of trading time for money?
Well, this gets into the difference between capital gain, cash flow, and currency moves, like a electrical current or a current in a river. And when you look at a financial statement, there's always another financial statement associated with it. For example, on my financial statement, maybe I have a checking account with a bank. Well, on the bank's financial statement, that's a liability because they owe that money to me. I gave it to them; they owe it back. So you'll see cash flow between you. If you go shopping at Neiman Marcus, well, you see money leaving your financial statement, but they see income. So your expense is their income. So when you understand cash flow, you start to see that capital gain doesn't do that. Capital gain simply increases net worth. It increases the total in your asset column, but it doesn't produce cash. And so that's really, really important to when you ask that question. Okay, does the stock produce cash, or is it just going up and down? Does the real estate produce cash, or is it going up and down? So here's the difference. If I go to Zillow, for example, and Marcy and I have money in syndication, and we also have single family homes in their own LLCs. So we have big projects and small projects. In the cash flow game, they call this a big deal, where you got to be accredited to play the syndication game. And then you have small deals, which we started out with. Like, we've had these for years, which by the way, will bring up another important, maybe after the break, we can get into another important one. But anyway, if you look at Zillow right now, and I just look at what Zillow thinks, their opinion, you'd see an increase in the prices of those homes overall. Different month to month, up some, down some, but the overall trend has been up. But that doesn't say anything about cash flow. So flippers don't get cash flow. Flippers get capital gains. They buy low and sell high. There's not a cash flowing to them. It's more an increase, on the buy and sell. But people who rent, that's probably a better explanation of cash flow. So, I think that Robert, he invests a lot with Kenny McElroy, and I imagine Kenny's probably around 8,000 to 10,000 doors right now between all of the stuff they own a piece of. So Robert's owning a piece just with his stuff with Kenny, part of 8,000 to 10,000 doors, a lot of them. And every bit of that rent, some of that finds its way into their pockets. But that's cash flow. It doesn't matter if the value of the properties increase or decrease, they're just cash flowing. So in stocks, where Robert plays a little with that, but not much, he's done both in that, capital gain and cash flow. I remember we were in Peru one time, and we were on stage, and Robert had talked about Petro Brazil. I used to call them the Petro brothers because they were in thick with the government. And there was a lot of corruption there, and they got caught, and the stock plummeted. Well, that doesn't change the value of oil. It just means the company needs to reboot and behave themselves. So Petro Brazil was like $5. I mean, it was so cheap. And he bought a bunch with some leaps, which is called a long-term equity anticipation security. I said, Robert, you could have you've got a promise from someone else that you can buy that low in case it goes high over the next year. But I says you could also make a promise to buy it even cheaper, and if it went down lower, you'd get cash flow to buy. He says that's kind of interesting. So after the event was over, we're in the airport in Peru, Lima, and he got his broker on the phone. He says, "Here." he handed the phone to me. He says, "Tell my broker to do what you just said." And it was kind of a fun moment because in that moment, half of me was kind of talking to the broker on autopilot because I know how that stuff works. That's not hard for me. But the other half went back to the first time I read Rich Dad, Poor Dad. This is years ago. And my wife and I didn't know Robert when we read this book in the 90s. This is 30 years ago or whatever it was, 20, 30 years ago. And if you'd have told me, I just kind of thought, this is insane. Because I'm reading this book. I didn't know who Robert was. And I'm reading this book with my wife and, blah, blah, blah. If you'd have told me that within a few years, I'd be sitting in Lima, Peru, in the airport with Robert's broker, telling his broker what we were going to do, you'd have knocked me over with a feather. And the reason I share that story is, as you're listening, I hope you would understand what regular people, my wife Marcy and I are. We're no different than anybody else in the whole world. We're not special. We're not brilliant. We just really, really wanted to have money work for us. We didn't want to work for money. We didn't want to work for money. And at the time, we both had jobs when we read that book. So you can do it. You can do this. But that's an example of a premium. So that's a long-winded answer as always. That's my personality is how does it work in real estate? Rent. And how does it work in stocks? Premiums from options and dividends. And that's just the basic. There's other things we can do. But those are the basics, and that's what financial education does, is it changes, it absolutely changed our lives learning from these mentors. And it was more than a casual dip our toe in the water or a casual, let's kind of see this on the edge. It was a full on, no, we're going to do some things. So that's why I always pitch Stockcast bonus so much. Is I know there's a certain amount of people listening here that are fed up and they're ready to really make a major shift, not just a minor dabbling. Most people don't want it enough. They're just going to dabble and, but they don't really have a change in their routine. We've talked about a weekly meeting before. If you're listening right now, did you have your weekly meeting this week? For most people listening, the answer was unfortunately no. And it starts with paying attention. What you focus on expands. And when I mean focus, that's not a flashlight, looking at all this stuff. It's like, whoosh. So yeah, that's how the cash flow works.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, let's take a quick break. These Rich Dad rules.
I got a big one when we come back. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, Andy's doing a great job helping us decode these principles. But when we come back, we're going to go deeper into how you can apply these rules and to start building wealth the Rich Dad way. And don't forget, stockcastbonus.com is where you'll find free tools to help you apply these concepts from cash flow investing to financial education. We've got you covered. Stick around. More with Andy Tanner right after this.
So far, it's been great. I needed a source where I could really enrich my education through stocks. I didn't really have an avenue for it, and it's helped me a lot. The simplicity has really gotten me on the track to where I enjoy the learning as well as it's really solidifying in my mind. And they're not just trying to sell you something, they really care about the people that are in the course, and they really do care about you and your personal goals, and what you want to do is to help you and your family and whatever your goals are in life through that. So it's really been great.
Welcome back to Rich Dad Stockcast. We're decoding the Rich Dad rules of money with Andy Tanner. And now it's time to turn these ideas into action. Now, Andy, before we went to break, you teased us with a big story. So lay it on us. What do you have for us?
Well, there's some other rules in the book, but also a one that really hit me, and they're sort of related. So I'll do the one that's in the book, and then I'll tell the story. And I'm also going to invoke Matthew McConaughey, who I actually had to warm up to because I didn't like Matthew very much. So I'll tell a little story that we probably have to edit this one out because it's too long-winded. But my wife and I, in our prenuptial agreement, which is not really formal, it's a handshake. I said, sweetie, there's one thing, I don't do chick flicks. I don't watch Sleepless in Seattle. That type of stuff. I just can't do it. Right. And so my wife says, let's watch How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days. And that was my first Matthew McConaughey movie. And he looked to me there like it was a guy that couldn't take a punch. If a dude can't take a punch, that's it, right? He didn't occur to me as a guy that could take a punch. So we're watching How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days. And it was late at night. My wife fell asleep. And I'm like, glorious. So I switched to Sports Center. And she woke up. She goes, "What?" I go, "Hey, you fell asleep, right?" But as I followed his career and he started to become more of a writer and author, I've appreciated what he had to say. And I'm gonna say this because I borrowed it from him. I wish I would have learned it when my sons were younger, but nonetheless, I used it the other day. And my younger son, is 18, and I used it. What he said. He tells a story, and this is so relevant. So maybe you don't edit this. I don't know, but he tells a story about when he's young, his dad says, get out there and mow the grass. And so he goes out and he can't start the lawnmower. He can't start the lawnmower. He can't. And he goes into his dad and he says, I can't mow the grass because I can't start the lawnmower. His dad said, what did you just say? What? He says, are you saying that you can't, or are you just having a little trouble? What a great moment. Is it that you can't start the lawnmower, or are you just having a little trouble? So dad goes out and he, and there's really three things. There's gas, spark, and air to start a lawnmower. And if the lawnmower doesn't start, you got a problem with spark, gas, or air. It's the carburetor or spark plug or the flywheel. That's the formula for a lawnmower: gas, spark, and oxygen. For any combustible engine, that's the trifecta. And so he attacked that problem, and then all of a sudden, like, and so he really learned that the word can't is a really dangerous word, because if you read the book Rich Dad, Poor Dad, Robert expounds on this. The moment we say the word can't, then our brain stops working on the problem. It quits. And you rob yourself of your brain's power, because basically you've just shut off the light switch. You've just shut off the engine. You've shut off the creativity. You shut off everything, and you've quit when you see I can't. Now I did it differently than my kids. I wish I would have done it different, but I remember my son, when he was really young, maybe 9, he was having a hard time throwing the ball far enough from 3 points to get it in. He was trying. He says, Dad, I can't throw it that far. I said, well, then let's quit. That's how I did it. I says, well, if you can't, there's no point in trying, so let's leave. And I took him home. I said, we're done. If you can't do it, well, then why are we trying to do something we can't do? I mean, I can't jump from here to the moon. That's why I don't try. Right? I don't get a running start and try to get that far because I know I can't, so I've never tried. And if that's the same thing here, you should just stop trying. And that was a little more harsh than Matthew McConaughey, where he says, is it you can't, or you just having a little trouble? So the big can't in the book from Robert is there's a rule that's really important. We're never allowed to say we can't afford it. We're never allowed to say can't afford it, because that shuts the brain off. So how do you turn the brain on? You ask a question. How can I afford it? That is a rule of money. How can I afford it? If it's something that I want, how can I afford it? And just as a lawnmower needs gas and spark and oxygen, the same way there's just certain things. Like, for example, to buy things, what do you need? Well, you might need the ability to raise money. Well, I can't raise money. Well, no. Or you just having a little trouble. Well, I'll tell you how to raise money. You get a BI triangle, and There's always an answer of how to do it. There's another great film. We're doing filmography today with Anthony Hopkins, and I think it might be Baldwin. I can't remember, but I remember Anthony Hopkins. And they're in the wilderness, and the plot is this outdoorsy guy is going to take a city guy, Hopkins, into the mountains and try to kill him because he just can't handle the harshness of it. And there's a phrase he says a bunch of times. He says, what one man can do, another can do. What one human can do, another human can do. That's really true. And as far as intellectual labor, now, not everyone can dunk like LeBron, but intellectually, everyone can learn what anyone else can learn. Everyone can. It's just a matter of effort. So this idea of I can't afford it is, it's bullshit. It's just not. It is a pile of it. Look, are you saying you can't afford this or these stocks, or are you just saying you're having a little trouble? Which is it? Because you're having a little trouble, we can help you. Oh, how? Well, buy the options to the stock. Now you control the stock at a cheaper price, right? Or I can't afford this. Well, raise capital. Well, I have good credit. Doesn't matter. All this stuff, I can't. That's a huge money rule. How can I afford it? How can I learn it? How can I do it? That turns the brain on to solve problems, and you go into learning mode instead of quitting mode. So in essence, how do you want to spend your life? Learning mode or quitting mode?
Huge. That is huge. And to add to that, I hope the listener really solidifies that in their brain. That was huge for me.
Yeah.
At the beginning of my investing career. When I read that, stop saying I can't, ask yourself, how can I? That was such a shift for me. I remember buying my first rental property, being in my early 20s. Like, I can't buy this because I'm in my early 20s.
I'm 20. Yeah.
I'm 20. That was my excuse. But when I said, how can I do it? The wheels started turning, and it was just amazing what happened. I was able to buy that first rental. So I love that philosophy, that mindset shift. So if someone's new to this mindset shift, what's one rich dad principle they should focus on first? Like, how can they put it into practice this very week?
Well, the first principle in Rich Dad Poor Dad is the rich don't work for money. We covered that. So what's lesson number 6? That's the question and the answer. Rule number 1, principle number 1, the rich don't work for money. Number 6 in that book, and I'm drawing that out so people who've read the book can really feel and kind of suffer a little bit like, wow, I read the book, but I don't know what's in it. I mean, it's kind of, you lie to yourself. Well, I read that book. Yeah, but do you know what's in it? Because if you don't know what the 6th one is, then how are you applying it or know whether you're applying it or not? So the 6th one is this. The rich don't work for money. The rich work to learn. Well, I can't afford college. I can't afford a finance degree. I can't. You can go to Stockcast bonus and you can introduce yourself to us and you can begin to put in some work to learn. You can. And so that's how you start right now is you go from that first principle to that last principle of the rich work at learning. So while Kim is living in her car, while Robert is sleeping on the couch at their friends because they refused to work for money, what were they working? Were they just hanging out or were they doing stuff? No, they got up in the morning and they did stuff. And they began to learn what one person can do, another person can do, what one guy can learn, another guy can learn. And it was the learning that was the gold. And Warren Buffett is who he is, not because he bought stocks. A lot of people buy stocks and lose. He's who he is because of what he learned and his temperament, his discipline. It's his routine. And that's what we're about. So do we have time for one more or are we closed? I promised one more and we haven't delivered on that yet.
Well, let's do. We're getting towards the end of time, but let's slide in one more.
This was really big, for my kids, and it's really big for Marcy and I because it's a painful thing for us to think about ever doing this. Two lessons, 3 lessons. The kids keep them bigger. Robert and Kim had Betty the bookkeeper. So part of their routine is I'm going to ask you, do you have a bookkeeper? My bookkeeper's name is Laurie. For years, Robert and Kim had Betty as their first bookkeeper. So the question is, now someone says, well, I can't afford a bookkeeper. There you go. No, how can I afford a bookkeeper, right? It is a matter of priority, right? I was in a meeting last night where a guy said, win every hour. You got 16 hours after you sleep every day, win every hour. And there's always an hour you're not winning. There's an hour where you're not winning. So how can I get a bookkeeper? So they would go to the bookkeeper, and they had a rule that they could never say, I can't afford it. And so if Robert wanted a Ferrari, the rule was you can have anything you want, but you must have an asset that pays for it. In other words, you're not going to go into debt for a Ferrari unless you have an asset that will pay that debt. So you could borrow money to get the Ferrari as long as you had an equal and opposing income from an asset. So, for example, if you were to look at a house payment and you wanted to get a bigger house with a bigger house payment, first you'd get 5 rentals that would cover that increase in your current house payment or something like that. So the rule in their relationship was you can have anything you want, but you must buy an asset that will pay for it. And so the question became, how can I afford a Ferrari? Well, okay, how can I get this asset? So the answer, how can I, is a learning thing, right? It's, I don't know how yet, so let's figure it out and learn. So it starts to weave together. So that's a big one. You can have anything you want, but you will buy an asset to pay for it. Well, that leads into a really important one that has really been big for Marcy and I. If you have a cash flowing asset, here's a big rule. We're talking about the rules of money. Their rule was and is, if something goes into the asset column that's a cash flowing asset, it's never to be removed, ever. So it's a one-way door. And so we don't flip. Now, gold would be different. Bitcoin would be different because those don't cash flow. They're capital gain assets. So, if Robert sees the price of gold at 4,000, and decides he wants to sell some, he could. That's fine because he's not going to lose any cash flow from doing that. He's going to just simply trade gold for cash, and it's a trade, right? That's why we call it trading. But as far as like a rental property, like there's certain stocks that I will never, ever, 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 ever sell unless the cash flow stops. So if it cash flows, it stays. It cash flows, it stays. Now, you could upgrade it, but that cash is remaining in the asset column. You could trade it up, but you would never sell an asset, liquidate it to buy a liability. Never. Because that violates that rule. If you want something, get something that pays for it through the cash flow. So we don't reduce cash flow. Once it's established, we don't sell those assets. You can upgrade them, but you don't liquidate them. There's a big difference. You can upgrade them. You take 4 green houses and turn it into a red hotel because that's staying in the column. But you don't sell those 4 green houses to buy your vacation home, right? So that's a huge one. Once the asset gets in there, it doesn't leave. It grows. You can upgrade it, but you can't liquidate it for a liability. Never. Never, 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 never. So that one's not in Rich Dad, Poor Dad, but that's a great one. So you have that 3 things. Betty the bookkeeper keeps the books. When you say, Betty, I want to buy this, she says, nope, there's none of cash flow. So, okay, I got to go buy this asset. I can have anything I want, but I have to buy the asset to pay for it. And that's hard. That's not one I've been perfect in. Sometimes I've been frivolous and, maybe a gift or I just want something for myself. I just really want this. But when I heard Kim say that, it kind of redoubled our efforts to do whatever we can to make sure we keep assets in the asset column. And rather, it's too easy to sell one, click and sell. It takes more to say, how can I get another one? And that's the grind. It's the fun. So work to learn.
There we go. What a great note to end on. Whether it's learning how to think like an investor and paying ourselves first or escaping the trap for, working for money, the Rich Dad rules aren't just theories. They're the foundation for real wealth. Andy, it's always a masterclass when you join us here. We appreciate your insights as always. And listener, if today's episode sparked something in you, don't just nod your head. act, take action. Go to stockcastbonus.com. Get the tools and resources there to help you to apply what you've learned today. And if you're serious about growing your financial intelligence, like this episode, subscribe, share it with someone who's ready to stop following the old rules and start creating real freedom. You're not here by accident. You're building something that most people won't. So stay smart, stay invested, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Del.
This podcast is a presentation of Rich Dad Media Network.